The truth about Little Richard will break your heart. While Elvis was crowned king, Richard was losing millions to corrupt contracts. While Pat Boone got rich copying his songs, Richard couldn't even walk through the front door of venues he headlined. Today, we expose the dark side of rock and roll's birth, how record labels, racism, and greed nearly destroyed the man who started it all, and why he had to sue for $112 million just to get a fraction of what he deserved. Richard Wayne Penniman was born on December 5, 1932, in Macon, Georgia. He was supposed to be named Ricardo, but a mistake on his birth certificate changed it to Richard. He was the third of 12 children in a family that was both strict and complicated. His father, Charles Bud Penniman, was a church deacon, but at the same time, he ran a nightclub and made money selling illegal liquor. Music was everywhere in his life. His family was deeply religious, and church was a big part of his world. His grandfather and uncles were preachers, and the family went to different churches, from Baptist to Pentecostal. But it was the Pentecostal churches that excited him the most. They had energy. The singing was loud, the worship was powerful, and Richard fell in love with it. By the time he was 10, people in his community saw him as some kind of faith healer. He would go around singing gospel songs and praying for the sick, and people swore they felt better after he touched them. Sometimes, they even gave him money. Church also gave him his first taste of what it was like to perform. He had a voice that couldn't be ignored, strong, raw, and full of power. In fact, it was so loud and intense that one time he was told he couldn't sing in the choir anymore because he was screaming and hollering too much. But that was just how he sang. And later, that same wild, uncontrollable voice would make him a rock and roll legend. Outside of church, Richard was hearing other kinds of music. Macon, Georgia, in the 1940s, was filled with gospel, blues, and early rhythm and blues. He soaked it all in, but there was one moment that changed everything for him. In 1947, when he was just 14, he was singing outside the Macon City Auditorium when gospel star sister Rosetta Tharpe heard him. She was a big deal, and she was so impressed that she asked him to open her show. Not only did he get to perform, but he was paid for it. If someone like her thought he was good enough, then maybe he really could be something. But just as he was figuring out who he wanted to be, his home life fell apart. His father didn't like how Richard acted. He didn't like his mannerisms. He didn't like what he suspected about his son's sexuality. And by the time Richard was 13, his father had had enough. He kicked him out. It was a brutal experience. He was still a kid, but now he had to survive on the streets. He had no choice but to grow up fast. He did anything he could to get by, but one thing never changed. He kept singing. He looked for places where he could perform, no matter what kind of place it was. By the time he was 16, he found himself in a whole new world. Dr. Nubillo's traveling show. It was wild. It was strange. It was nothing like church. Dr. Nubillo wore capes and turbans, and one of the attractions in the show was a preserved baby with clawed feet and tiny horns. It was the kind of place where anything could happen, and Richard loved it. This was where he learned how to be more than just a singer. He learned how to perform, how to make an audience pay attention, how to hold their eyes on him the whole time. He started wearing capes and turbans himself. He started pushing things even further, even dressing in drag under the stage name Princess Lavon. On that stage, he could be as loud, as big, and as wild as he wanted. When little Richard was 18, he thought he had made it. He signed a deal with RCA Victor, one of the biggest record labels at the time. This was supposed to be his big break, but instead, it was a disaster. On March 31st, 1951, he released his first single, Every Hour. The song became a small hit in Georgia, and for the first time, his father, who never supported his music, started playing it on the jukebox at his nightclub. But that was it. His next songs, like Taxi Blues, went nowhere. RCA Victor didn't care enough to promote his music, and worst of all, the songs didn't sound like him. He was recording slow blues tracks that didn't match his energy. He wasn't the wild, electrifying performer he was born to be. He was just another singer with forgettable songs. By February 1952, RCA Victor dropped him. Just like that, his music career was over before it even started. With no record deal and no money, he had to find a job. He started washing dishes at the Greyhound bus station in Macon, Georgia. But even in that loud, steamy kitchen, he couldn't stop singing. At first, his co-workers told him to shut up, but after a while, they started cheering him on. They told him he was too good to be washing dishes. He kept performing in tiny clubs, house parties, even on the streets. He was loud, flashy, and full of energy. One night at the TikTok Club, he met Lloyd Price, a singer who told him about a record label called Specialty Records. That conversation would change everything. On September 14, 1955, he walked into J&M Studio in New Orleans. He had been performing a song for years that always got the crowd going, Tutti Frutti. The original lyrics were wild, way too dirty for radio. The chorus had lines like, Tutti Frutti, good booty, and if it don't fit, don't force it. No way that was making it onto the radio. The producer, Bumps Blackwell, called in a songwriter named Dorothy Labostri to clean it up. She quickly changed the words to the now famous Tutti Frutti, oh, Rooty. Same energy, but now it was radio-friendly. Then the real magic happened. The first time they tried recording the song, it didn't sound right. It was too controlled, too careful. Richard was frustrated, so he slammed the piano, screamed into the mic, and let loose. The energy exploded. His voice was so powerful, the studio engineers had to move the microphones back so they wouldn't break. In just 15 minutes, Tutti Frutti was recorded. When it was released in October 1955, it changed music forever. It hit number 2 on the R&B charts and even made it onto the pop charts, a huge deal for a black artist in the 1950s. As his fame grew, so did his personality. He wore heavy makeup, lined his eyes with eyeliner, and styled his hair into a huge pompadour. His outfits were loud, covered in sequins and silk, in colors that demanded attention. After Tutti Frutti, he kept dropping hit after hit. In 1956, he released Long Tall Sally. He knew that a white singer, Pat Boone, would try to cover it like he did with Tutti Frutti, so Richard recorded it as fast as possible. Boone couldn't keep up, and Richard's version became the one everyone remembered. The song hit number 1 on the R&B charts and became his first million seller. More hits followed. Slippin' and Slidin', Rip It Up, and The Girl Can't Help It All became huge. Then, in 1958, he released Good Golly, Miss Molly, another wild, fast, high-energy song that became legendary. Between 1956 and 1959, Little Richard had 17 top 40 R&B singles and 9 top 40 pop hits. He wasn't just making music, he was shaping rock and roll itself. His music broke racial barriers, bringing black and white audiences together at a time when America was still deeply segregated. Little Richard was on top of the world in 1957. He had hit after hit, was making $10,000 a week, and had sold over 32 million records. His concerts were packed, his music was everywhere, and his career couldn't have been bigger. Then, out of nowhere, he shocked everyone. On October 12th, during a huge show in Sydney, Australia, he stepped off the stage and announced he was done. His fans were stunned. His band was left without jobs. His record label, which had just spent a fortune promoting his latest song, Keep a Knockin', couldn't believe it. And the craziest part? Only days before, he had recorded Good Golly, Miss Molly, a song that would later become one of his biggest hits. The reason behind his decision was just as dramatic as the announcement itself. While flying from Melbourne to Sydney, he saw what he thought was a fireball streaking across the sky. To him, it was a sign from God, though it was later revealed to be the Russian satellite Sputnik 1. Then, when he landed, he found out that the plane he was originally supposed to take had crashed into the Pacific Ocean. The combination of fear, guilt, and a deep feeling that something bigger was at play overwhelmed him. He was convinced he had to change his life. To prove his devotion, he pulled off 4 diamond rings worth $8,000 and threw them into Sydney's Hunter River, declaring that he was leaving rock music to serve God. In late 1957, at just 25 years old, he enrolled at Oakwood College and started studying theology. He took his religious transformation seriously, even telling students that his past music was the devil's work, and offering to buy back their records so he could destroy them. He planned to burn them in a bonfire near the school's bell tower. But while he was passionate about his new path, he wasn't exactly a model student. He skipped classes often, and when he did show up, he could be loud and disruptive. The school tolerated him, knowing that his presence alone gave them prestige. He stayed at Oakwood until 1959, and even formed a gospel group called the Pequod Quartet. They toured on weekends, earning $500 per concert. But Richard's love for luxury meant much of that money was spent on expensive hotels. Even though he left rock music, he never truly left music itself. Between 1959 and 1962, he recorded 3 gospel albums: God is Real, Pray Along with Little Richard, Volume 1, and Pray Along with Little Richard, Volume 2. At the same time, he started the Little Richard evangelistic team, traveling across the country to preach and sing gospel. His larger-than-life personality made him a powerful preacher, and his ability to blend fiery sermons with high-energy gospel performances drew massive crowds. But Richard's biggest battle wasn't just between rock and gospel. It was the lifelong conflict between his religious beliefs and his sexuality. He had grown up in a deeply religious home in Macon, Georgia, and had always struggled with guilt over his attractions. His feelings constantly shifted. In 1984, he described himself as both male and female, saying, "Sex to me is like a smorgasbord. Whatever I feel like, I go for." But at other times, he called homosexuality unnatural and sinful. His marriage to Ernestine Harvin in 1959 lasted only 4 years, with many believing the real reason for their divorce was his internal struggles with his sexuality. Then, in 1962, just before returning to rock music, he was arrested for approaching men in a restroom. In later years, his statements about sexuality continued to change. At one point, he told Penthouse magazine, "I've been gay my whole life." But in 2017, in an interview with a Christian network, he condemned homosexuality entirely. No matter how much he tried to reconcile the two sides of his life, the struggle never truly left him. In 1962, after 5 years away from rock and roll, Richard shocked everyone by returning. He was struggling financially, and the strict life of a religious figure was wearing on him. British promoter Don Arden convinced him that his records were still selling well in Europe and that fans were desperate for his return. He couldn't resist. His comeback performance at the Tower Ballroom in New Brighton, England, was a massive success. But what made the tour even more legendary was his opening act, a young, up-and-coming band called the Beatles. The Beatles were huge fans of Richard. Paul McCartney had studied his singing style and even copied his famous whoo in Long Tall Sally. During the tour, Richard gave them advice, even helping Paul improve his voice. The tour took them to Hamburg, Germany, where another young musician joined Richard's band, a 16-year-old Billy Preston, who would later work with the Beatles in their final years. Richard's comeback was a massive success, but it also caused controversy. Many of his religious followers felt betrayed. The church community that once supported him turned against him. But Richard didn't care. He was back. The tour made him famous all over again. He jumped right in, releasing Bama Lama Bama Lou in 1964. It did well in the UK, but barely made a mark in the US. He signed with VJ Records and put out a new album, Little Richard is Back, hoping to win over the new generation of music fans. But times had changed. British rock bands were taking over, and labels like Motown and Stax were dominating the charts. No matter what he did, he couldn't get back to where he once was. Then, in 1970, it seemed like things were finally turning around. He signed with Reprise Records and released The Real Thing, mixing rock with funk and soul. The single Freedom Blues even made it to number 47 on the Billboard Hot 100. That was the highest he had charted since 1958. Critics liked the album, but it didn't sell the way he hoped. While he was fighting to stay relevant in music, he was also battling something much worse: addiction. By 1975, he was hooked on cocaine, heroin, and PCP. He later admitted that he was spending up to $1,000 a day on drugs. His body was falling apart. He said that every time he blew his nose, blood and pieces of flesh would come out. It wasn't just drugs he was struggling with. He was torn between his faith and his sexuality. In 1984, he called homosexuality unnatural. But in 1985, he admitted that his father had kicked him out when he was 15 because he was gay. He kept going back and forth, never fully at peace with himself. Then, in 1977, something happened that shook him to his core. His friend Larry Williams pulled a gun on him over a drug debt. That, combined with the deaths of his brother and two close friends, made him rethink everything. Exactly 15 years after his comeback show with the Beatles, he stood in front of a crowd and announced he was done with rock and roll. Meanwhile, movies and TV gave him a new way to connect with audiences. In 1986, he appeared in Down and Out in Beverly Hills, playing a wild, eccentric neighbor. The movie was a hit, making over $62 million at the box office. But the real highlight was a song he wrote for the movie called Great Gosh A'Mighty, and it actually charted. He also became a regular guest on TV. In 1982, he appeared on Late Night with David Letterman and made headlines by saying, "God gave me the victory. I'm not gay now, but, you know, I was gay all my life." It was another example of the inner battle he always seemed to be fighting. Back in 1969, he had even appeared on a Monkees TV special, keeping himself in the public eye in any way he could. In 1955, Little Richard signed a contract with Specialty Records, and it turned out to be one of the worst deals in music history. He was promised just half a cent for every record sold. That meant when Tutti Frutti sold 500,000 copies, he only made $25,000. White artists at the time were making much more, usually between 3% and 5% of their sales. But it wasn't just the low royalties that hurt him. Specialty's owner, Art Roop, bought the publishing rights to Tutti Frutti for only $50. This meant that Richard lost out on all the money that song would continue to make in the future. Even worse, his contract said he wouldn't get paid if his music was used in movies, commercials, or covered by other artists. And since his songs were some of the most influential in rock and roll history, this clause cost him a fortune. Richard later explained why he had agreed to such an unfair deal. He was young, poor, and had no experience in business. His father had died, his mother was raising 12 kids, and he just wanted to help his family. He took whatever he was offered because he didn't know any better. But this wasn't just about him. This was happening to black artists all over the music industry. Record labels routinely gave them terrible contracts, knowing they had fewer opportunities and no real way to fight back. As Richard's music became more and more popular, the true scale of his financial losses became clear. Tutti Frutti, Long Tall Sally, and Good Golly, Miss Molly were massive hits. They became the foundation of rock and roll. White artists covered them, movies used them, and radio stations played them constantly. But because of his contract, Richard saw almost none of the money. While Specialty Records and others made millions off his music, he got practically nothing in return. It wasn't just the lost royalties that hurt. Richard's music shaped the sound of future generations, inspiring everyone from the Beatles to Prince. But he wasn't paid for his influence. Even when Tutti Frutti hit 3 million copies by 1968, he had only earned a tiny fraction of what he should have. After decades of being exploited, Richard decided to fight back. In 1984, nearly 30 years after leaving Specialty Records, he sued them for $112 million. He accused them of withholding royalties for decades. His lawsuit wasn't just about money. It was about exposing the way black artists had been used and discarded by the industry. The legal battle went on for 2 years, drawing attention to just how unfair the industry had been to its pioneers. In 1986, the case was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. But it was clear that Richard didn't get anywhere near the $112 million he originally sought. Even after winning the lawsuit, his financial struggles didn't end. While the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and other stars inspired by him became wealthy, Richard was still struggling. His records weren't promoted properly, and record labels weren't pushing his new music. Even as his influence remained huge, his earnings never matched his impact. Because of all this, Richard had to keep performing just to survive. Unlike other rock legends who made millions from record sales, he had to rely on live shows. Touring wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. The industry had pushed him aside, and his only way to make money was through exhausting, non-stop performances. Meanwhile, Richard faced racism everywhere he went. On tour, he couldn't stay in the same hotels as white performers. Some venues wouldn't even let him walk through the front door. In the South, his concerts were segregated. Black fans were forced to sit in separate sections, sometimes in the balcony, while white audiences had better seats. In 1957, at the peak of his fame, he arrived at a major venue only to be told he had to use the service entrance and a makeshift dressing room. He wasn't allowed in the main areas, even though he was the star of the show. Instead of staying quiet, Richard spoke up, saying, "I may be Little Richard, but I've got a big voice, and I won't be silenced by your small minds." No matter how famous he became, he was still treated as less than his white counterparts. While white rock and roll stars played in the biggest venues, Richard was mostly stuck on what was called the Chitlin Circuit. These were clubs and theaters across the eastern and southern U.S. that welcomed black performers at a time when segregation kept them out of mainstream venues. He played at famous spots like the Royal Peacock in Atlanta and the Apollo Theater in Harlem. But the difference between how he was treated at home and overseas was shocking. In the US, he was still limited by racism, but in Europe, he was treated like a king. When he toured there in 1962, crowds packed the venues to see him. In the UK, the Beatles even opened for him. While he was filling stadiums in London and Paris, back home he still had to fight for basic recognition. Despite shaping rock and roll, Richard was constantly overlooked for awards. When the Grammy Awards started in 1959, he wasn't nominated, even though he had already changed the music world. It took nearly 40 years for him to finally receive a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award in 1993. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame recognized his contributions in 1986, but Richard had spent years demanding credit before that happened. He had watched white artists like Elvis Presley and Jerry Lee Lewis receive endless praise, while black pioneers like himself were often ignored. At the 1988 Grammy Awards, Richard famously declared, "I am the architect of rock and roll. I am the originator." It was a moment of both pride and frustration. He knew he had built the foundation of rock, but history kept pushing him aside. However, Richard was honored many times in his later years. In 2015, he received the Rhapsody and Rhythm Award from the National Museum of African American Music. This award meant a lot because it recognized him as one of the pioneers who opened doors for future artists. Even when he could no longer perform because of health problems, heart issues, hip surgery, and aging, his music never faded away. It kept showing up in movies, making sure new generations heard his work. Films like Green Book, 2018, and Casino, 1995, featured his songs, proving that his sound still had power long after he had left the stage. But Richard was never just a musician. He was a cultural icon. His wild personality, flashy clothes, and unstoppable energy made him stand out. Even later in life, he spoke up about racism in the music industry, calling out how black artists had been underpaid and taken advantage of for years. He wasn't afraid to say the truth. He knew how the industry worked, and he wanted people to remember who really built rock and roll. When he passed away on May 9, 2020, tributes flooded in from some of the biggest stars in music, including Paul McCartney and Mick Jagger. It was clear he wasn't just respected, he was legendary. His music didn't just stay in history books. It kept showing up everywhere, in movies, commercials, and TV shows, proving how timeless it was. Long Tall Sally was used in Predator, 1987, blasting in the background as soldiers flew into battle. It gave the scene energy and attitude, just like Richard's music always did. In Casper, 1995, he wrote a song for the ending called Casper the Friendly Ghost, proving he could adapt his style to anything. Casino, 1995, used Slippin' and Slidin', making the moment between Robert De Niro and Sharon Stone feel even more intense. Green Book, 2018, included Lucille, which helped bring the 1960s setting to life. Even commercials used his music. Geeko featured him in an ad, reminding everyone of his place in rock history. His songs weren't just old hits, they were still shaping culture. Even in his last years, Richard stayed larger than life. His bold outfits, wild hairstyles, and over-the-top performances had inspired generations. Prince, one of the biggest pop stars ever, borrowed heavily from Richard's style. Even when Richard could no longer perform, his influence was everywhere. And when he passed at 87, the music world didn't just lose a legend, they lost the man who helped create the sound of rock and roll. His music, his style, his fight for fairness, it all still matters today.